You're listening to Fem Talk 89 FM. I'm Alisia Evans here in Istanbul, Turkey, where we've just covered the opening ceremony for the first ever World Humanitarian Summit. State representatives, INGOs and civil society leaders have all converged on this historic city to endorse a set of core commitments, including commitments to gender equality and women's empowerment in humanitarian action. And on Fem Talk now is the Deputy Prime Minister of Samoa, Fiame Naomi Mataafa. Madam Deputy Prime Minister, thank you for joining me on Fem Talk 89 FM. And we've just witnessed the opening of the WHS. And representing the Pacific, what would you say are the priorities of Pacific Small Island developing states at the summit?
I think climate change will be the priority for the Pacific, and given the international meetings that we've just had earlier in the year and the ratifications for the climate change conventions. From our particular perspective in Samoa, we want to put some emphasis on the gender issues, the gender inequalities, and really looking at the vulnerable groups. So of course the disabled sector is one of the areas that we're wanting to give some focus on and participate in the commitments that are being made.
Thank you. You've just said climate change, and that brings me nicely to my next question, because Samoa has recently borne the brunt of natural disasters. So when we talk about the resilience of communities, and particularly women, what stands out for you in the role of women as first responders and in leading community resilience, particularly if they represent women with disabilities, for example?
Well, I think the biggest disaster that we had was the tsunami. It's a few years ago now. And of course, the women's response is always, first and foremost, their families and their communities. And it was very interesting for me when the tsunami happened, that the immediate response around the communities close to the area that was hit, and my area is quite close to it, the women got together very quickly and put together, the basic supplies that families would need. The mats, the linens, the pots and the pans. And then, of course, the men got the food ready. And what was really encouraging for me in that instance was, in terms of first response, that, families went, and next door neighbors went. And perhaps in the case of cyclones, where the effect is much more, there's a wider spread. But because the tsunami only hit a particular part of the country, all the other parts, where their families and relatives were there, the immediate response was there. In terms of more formal responses, in terms of government, well, we're quite set up with our disaster preparedness. Our Prime Minister leads the Committee for Disaster. Interestingly enough, it's a woman who heads up our disaster unit. I observe that she operates in a different way from how men operate. She's a lot more organic, in terms of, she's going through the procedures, but you can see that she also utilizes a lot of other different networks, and and there may be networks through communities, women, and so forth. Yeah.
So she doesn't just operate in isolation with the formal government processes.
No. And I think you're hearing that kind of message around this summit, that formal interventions, government to government interventions, are important, and they set the base and direction, I suppose. But it's really when they say everyone's responsible, so that's the community responsibilities, the individual responsibilities, where people bring, in a sense, their spheres of influence to bear on whatever the situation is. And that would be inclusive also of women's organizations. And in Samoa, the women's organizations are very strong at the village level, at the church level, and also at the national NGO level. So, it's quite layered. And I think that's also important. That not only is it layered in the sense that they cover a lot, but also tiered in the sense where you're intervening at different levels, right at the decision-making level, right down to the community levels.
Okay, that's a really great example of how women interact in Samoa at different levels. But bringing it back to the summit here, the summit's been coined as something as a manutarian summit, as opposed to a humanitarian summit. And what needs to be done, so taking that example of the Samoan model, where you have lots of different interlinkages and interlinkages between the different levels, what needs to be done to kind of change the status quo in formal kind of responses to humanitarian disasters, and also ensure gender equality and that shift in power that you've seen in Samoa?
Well, it's interesting for me, once again, sort of observing that there seems to be a lot of momentum around this particular summit, the issues surrounding it. It was interesting, that the information, we're at a point now that there's so many millions of people affected through different situations, conflict situations in particular. We in the Pacific were a bit unfamiliar with that kind of situation, although of course there are conflict areas in our region, especially in the Papua issue, but perhaps we can talk about that in a different issue. But it's interesting for me, what does draw the international community to come together? And I don't think we can get away from it, because the media is reminding us every day, especially of the refugee situations here in Europe, and particularly here in Turkey, where the leader this morning was speaking about how they have the largest number of refugees, and I suppose because of their shared borders here with Syria and so forth. But then I think back, of many genocides in Africa, right? It never really drew, this kind of attention. So I think one of the messages here is that, when the people with the resources are affected, then, it also motivates them. And so what I suppose, being from a pragmatic point of view, whatever sets people off, as long as, their awareness is raised in terms of vulnerable sectors within our societies, whether it be conflict or natural disasters, the result is still the same. But we need that response, and whether that response then will be equitable, in terms of where the resources go, or whether it will be dominated by, those who are putting in the resources, and how that will be distributed. But, I think in terms of an international shift, it's very much warranted. And the presentations that were made this morning, was calling on our common humanity. And you don't often hear that in UN speak. So, and it really then comes back to people and communities taking up the responsibilities with their countries, in terms of the more formal commitments and responses.
Thank you. Just coming away from this summit and looking at Samoa, they're going to be hosting the Women's Ministerial meeting later this year. What can we expect from that?
It's the Commonwealth Ministers meeting. Well, in the Pacific, in my area of politics, where we have the lowest rates of representation. So that's always a a very constant message for us in the Pacific, and especially now that we're in this summit now, and it's about people participating, especially women. If they're going to be dealing with vulnerable groups, how many women are there, who are at that level of making decisions? I think we're getting there, but that message has to get through so much more in our region, given the very low rates of representation in the region. I think the other challenging issue for us in the Pacific is violence against women. All the inequalities in the world, they will be so much more exacerbated by that whole area of violence against women, if we are not resolving that issue. And then, of course, there's women's economic participation as an enabler for women to become more independent or more self-sufficient, not only for themselves but also for their families. So, generally those kind of three issues for the Pacific.
Not just three separate issues, but definitely
interlinked, of course.
Okay, finally, Deputy Prime Minister, there has been a lot of talk about intergenerational leadership, and you yourself have been a young woman involved at different levels of leadership, at different levels, obviously. And what is your tip to young women leaders who are engaged in politics today? What is that one piece of advice that you would like to give to young women leaders in the Pacific?
Well, we've just had our election in March, and I'm always asked this question. So it's not just young women, but women in general, because there's such a low level of representation. So I think the first thing for women is that if they have that interest, and sometimes when people talk about women in politics, you think all these thousands of women in the Pacific want to run. Well, that's not really true. But I think, once women are aware and they want to participate in that political process, then my key tip is that you have to understand what your political context is. What is it within that particular context that, you have to meet in order to succeed? Or, if there are so many barriers, then what do you need to do to chip away at institutional barriers and so forth? Quite apart from the whole social and social biases that people have. But if there are institutional barriers, then those are the things that you can systematically chip away at. But if you're not aware of that context, you're almost sort of operating in a bubble, or so it's a very real thing. So that's my tip.
Thank you very much, Deputy Prime Minister. That was Samoan Deputy Prime Minister Fiame Naomi Mataafa. I'm Alisia Evans. Stay tuned to Fem Talk for more coverage of the first World Humanitarian Summit.